Welcome back, everyone. As a philosopher, you're always trying to dig into those really fundamental concepts, the ones that seem so simple at first, like what is meaning? But then, the more you think about it, the more it kind of slips through your fingers.
It really does, doesn't it? I mean, even with all your philosophical training, it can feel like you're getting lost in a maze when you try to tackle meaning. And honestly, that's where resources like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy are just invaluable. So today, we're doing a deep dive into their entry on theories of meaning. And given our audience, I think we can really get into the philosophical nitty-gritty here.
Absolutely. We're not aiming for, like, a simple dictionary definition, more like we're mapping the territory, you know,
Mm.
getting a feel for the big debates and the core questions that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. Clarity, yes, but without losing the nuance. And right off the bat, the entry makes a distinction that's going to be our guiding light throughout this whole discussion.
Right from the start, they lean on this distinction from David Lewis. Two types of theory of meaning, he says. First, you've got your semantic theories. Those are all about what specific symbols or expressions actually mean, how they hook onto the world, so to speak.
Okay, so the what of meaning.
Exactly. And then there's metasemantic theories, and those dig into the why. Why do symbols have the meanings they do? What are the psychological, the social, the historical forces that shaped meaning itself?
Ah, I see. So it's like if you had a linguist who was carefully writing down all the grammar rules of a language, that'd be their semantic theory.
Yes.
But then that same linguist started asking, well, why did these particular rules arise in this culture?
That's your metasemantic question.
Right, the why behind the what.
I like it. Almost like if you had an anthropologist studying, say, table manners in
Yeah.
some society, describing which fork to use for salad, that's semantic. Figuring out why they have that fork salad custom, that's metasemantic. Perfect analogy. And though we're mainly focused on natural language today, words and sentences and all that, it is interesting to think, and the entry touches on this too, that this semantic versus metasemantic thing isn't limited to language. I mean, you could ask about the meaning of, I don't know, a mental image, a piece of music, and then why it has that particular significance for someone.
Yeah, that is really interesting to think about.
Whole other deep dives right there. But we'll stick with language for now, like the entry does.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, and one other thing to keep in mind as we go. The entry also mentions something called the verificationist theory of meaning. That one's all about when a sentence is meaningful at all, not what its meaning is or why it has it. It's historically important, but we're going to set it aside today. Stick with semantic and metasemantic theories in Lewis's sense.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so with that foundation laid, let's jump into the first big piece of this puzzle, those semantic theories, the what is meaning side of things. Where do we even begin with that?
Well, a key insight here, going all the way back to Frege, is the idea of compositionality. It seems kind of obvious, maybe, but it's profound. We can understand all sorts of new sentences because we get the meanings of the individual words, and we know how those words can be put together. So a compositional semantic theory tries to lay out systematically how the meaning of a whole sentence is built up from the meanings of its parts and how those parts are arranged. Kind of like, I don't know, building with Legos. You have the individual pieces and then you have rules for how they connect, and boom, you can make an endless variety of structures.
So like understanding how notes combine into melodies and melodies into symphonies, except with words and sentences.
Yes, exactly. It's that combinatorial power of language.
Cool. So within these compositional semantic theories, there's a category that the entry calls classical semantic theories. What's the defining feature of those, especially for someone coming at this from a philosophical angle?
Well, the core idea here is that sentences, most of them anyway, they're either true or false.
Right.
And that truth or falsity, that depends on the proposition the sentence expresses.
Makes sense.
So the big job for a semantic theory, at least in this view, is to explain how you go from the meanings of individual words, taking context into account, of course, to the proposition that the sentence expresses, and then from there to the conditions under which that proposition would be true. It's a very truth-centered approach to meaning.
Truth is definitely a big deal for us philosophers. All right, so it starts with this truth notion, and then you've got propositions playing a key role too. The entry then brings up something called the theory of reference. What's that all about, and what kind of philosophical assumptions are baked into it?
So at its simplest, the theory of reference is about pairing up expressions in language with whatever those expressions actually pick out in the world. So think of a name like Plato. The theory of reference would say, okay, the referent of that name is the actual historical figure Plato. And then when you have a sentence like, Plato wrote dialogues, Whether that sentence is true or not depends on whether the individual who's the referent of Plato actually did write any dialogues. It's assuming that a key part of what language does is let us talk about things in the world.
Okay, so mapping words to things, basically, and then using that mapping to figure out if what we're saying is true or not.
Exact.
But then the entry gets into some limitations with this whole reference-only view. They use Quine's example of chordates and renates.
Yeah.
Now, for a philosopher listening, what's the big takeaway from this thought experiment?
What Quine does so brilliantly here is show us that just because two terms pick out the exact same stuff in the world, we could say they're extensionally equivalent, that doesn't mean they have the same meaning, the same cognitive significance. So he asks us to imagine that just by chance, all the creatures that have hearts, which we call chordates, also happen to be all the creatures that have kidneys, which we'll call renates.
Okay, following so far.
So now think about two sentences. All chordates are chordates, and all chordates are renates. Now, if meaning was just about reference, those two sentences would mean the same thing, right? Because chordates and renates pick out the exact same set of creatures in the world.
But something feels off about that. Like intuitively, those two sentences don't seem to be saying the same thing.
Right. The first one is just kind of trivially true, like saying A equals A. But the second one, all chordates are renates. That could be a new and interesting discovery about biology, at least in principle. So just sharing a reference doesn't capture everything about meaning, about what we're actually communicating when we use those terms.
Right, right. And the entry points out that this whole issue gets even more obvious when you start embedding these sentences inside belief ascriptions. So, John believes that all chordates are chordates, versus John believes that all chordates are renates.
Oh, yeah. Good example.
It's totally possible that John could believe the first one, but not the second. But if meaning was just about reference, then swapping chordates for renates shouldn't change whether the belief ascription is true or not, since they refer to the same things. But clearly, it can change things.
That's the problem. And it suggests that meaning has to involve something more than just reference. There has to be some kind of content or sense that goes beyond what a term picks out in the world.
Okay, so just pointing to things in the world isn't enough, and that leads to the introduction of propositions. From a philosopher's viewpoint, what role do propositions play in trying to build a good semantic theory?
Well, if we zoom out for a second, propositions are kind of meant to address these very issues we've been talking about. You know, they're often described as the things that can be true or false, the objects of our beliefs, and what declarative sentences actually express. So instead of just saying, this sentence is true, we'd say, this sentence expresses a proposition, and that proposition is true. Propositions give us a more fine-grained way to talk about meaning, especially in these tricky cases where just looking at reference leads to problems.
All right, so they're like a deeper level of meaning than just truth values.
Yeah.
And the entry mentions this very important distinction that Frege makes. Sense determines reference, but not the other way around. Philosophically, what are the implications of that ordering? How should we understand the relationship between our thoughts, our words, and the world out there?
What's really profound about Frege's view is the idea that the sense of an expression, what we might think of as its cognitive content, that's what determines its reference. Different ways of thinking about the same object can still lead to that same object, but if you have the same way of thinking about something, you're going to end up at the same referent every time. And this applies to whole sentences where the proposition expressed is the sense and its truth or falsity is the reference, but it also applies to individual words and phrases. It really suggests that thought or cognitive content is playing a crucial mediating role in how language connects to the world.
So different mental paths can lead to the same destination.
Exactly.
But then you've got these tricky words like I, here, and now, where the reference changes depending on who's saying them and when and where. How does that kind of language fit into this whole framework of content and reference?
This is where things get really interesting, because you can't assign a single fixed content to those words that'll give you a consistent reference across all situations.
Right.
So you need a more abstract level of meaning, which is often called the character. It's like a rule or a function that takes the context of the utterance as input and then spits out the appropriate content as output. So the character of I is basically a rule that says, okay, in this context, the referent is whoever's speaking right now.
So the meaning of I isn't any specific person. It's this rule that picks out the right person depending on who's talking.
Precisely.
But now we've got a potential ambiguity, haven't we? When we talk about the meaning of a word, are we talking about this stable rule, the character, or the specific content that the rule gives you in a particular context?
Yeah, great question. The entry suggests that we should think of meaning in a pluralist way. Both the character and the content are important. The character is the stable, conventional part of meaning, and the content is what actually interacts with the world to determine truth or reference.
Okay, so both are playing their roles. And it's worth noting here that while I, here, and now are the classic examples of this context sensitivity, there's a lot of debate about just how many expressions in our language are sensitive to context in one way or another. Which makes you wonder, are there more things that are kind of secretly context sensitive than we realize?
Oh, yeah, that's a huge question in philosophy of language right now.
Right. All right, moving on. The entry then dives into something called possible worlds semantics. Now, for a philosopher who's used to thinking about meaning in terms of what exists in the actual world, this represents a pretty big shift in perspective. What's the core move here?
It's a huge shift. It basically says instead of just looking at what exists now, we need to think about meaning in terms of what could exist. So possible world semantics says that the content of an expression is an intention, which is a function from possible worlds to a reference.
Hold on, back up a sec. What do you mean by possible worlds?
Ah, good point. It's the idea that there are all these different ways the world could be, not just the way it actually is. Some of them will be very similar to our world, and some will be radically different.
Okay, I see.
So instead of saying that the meaning of the tallest person in the world is just whoever happens to be tallest right now, we'd say that its meaning is a function that tells you, for each possible world, who's the tallest person in that world.
So the meaning isn't stuck just in our reality, it stretches across all these other possible realities.
Right.
But how does this help with those problems we were talking about earlier, like the difference in meaning between chordates and renates, even though they refer to the same things in our world?
This is where it gets really cool. Even though chordate and renate might happen to pick out the same creatures here, in our world, it's very possible that in some other possible world, things would be different. Maybe there's a world where some creatures have hearts but not kidneys, or vice versa. So their intentions, those mappings across possible worlds, would be different, and that's why they have different meanings, even if their references happen to line up in this particular reality.
That is really neat. But then the entry points out a big challenge for this whole possible worlds idea,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to those statements that are true in absolutely every possible world,
Yes, the necessary truths.
like mathematical truths. What's the philosophical issue there?
The issue is that if two sentences are true in all the same possible worlds, then according to possible world semantics, they should have the same meaning. But that seems wrong, like 2 plus 2 to 4, and there are infinitely many prime numbers. Those are both necessarily true. But they don't seem to mean the same thing, do they? And again, you can have someone who believes one but not the other, which shouldn't be possible if their meanings were identical.
Right. They seem to involve different concepts, even if they both happen to be true, no matter how the world is.
Exactly.
The entry mentions that one way to try to fix this is to introduce impossible worlds into the picture. How does that even work? I mean, aren't impossible worlds? Well, impossible.
It's tricky stuff. The idea is that maybe we need to consider not just possible worlds that could exist, but also worlds that are logically contradictory, worlds where the normal rules don't apply. So you could have a world where 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4, or a world where there are finitely many prime numbers. And if you allow these impossible worlds into your semantic theory, then even necessary truths could potentially have different truth values in some of these worlds and therefore different meanings.
Philosophically, that's pretty mind-bending. Are you really saying we need to think about impossible scenarios to understand meaning?
Some people think so. It's definitely a controversial move.
No doubt about that. Okay, next up is Russellian semantics. How does this approach differ from the possible world framework we were just talking about?
Russellian semantics takes a very different tack. Instead of focusing on functions across possible worlds, it emphasizes the structure of propositions. The idea is that propositions are made up of the actual objects, properties, and relations that a sentence is about in the actual world. So Socrates is wise would be a proposition that contains Socrates himself and the property of being wise as its constituents. It's very much grounded in the stuff of this world.
So it's less about possibilities and more about the concrete building blocks of what we're talking about.
Right.
And how does this help with that problem of necessary truths seemingly having the same meaning in possible world semantics.
Because 2 plus 2, 4 would be a proposition built out of the numbers 2 and 4, and the relation of addition, while there are infinitely many prime numbers, would involve the concept of infinity and the property of being a prime number. These sentences have different subject matter, so they express different structured propositions, even if they happen to have the same truth value in all possible worlds.
Makes sense. So the difference in meaning comes from the difference in their parts, not from how they behave across different possible scenarios.
Exactly.
But the entry points out some pretty serious problems with Russellian semantics. What are some of those? Like, what's Russell's paradox of propositions?
Ah, that's a really deep one. Basically, Russell himself discovered this paradox that arises when you start talking about propositions that seem to refer to themselves. It throws a wrench into our understanding of how propositions can be structured and what sorts of things can be parts of them. It makes you wonder, what are the limits on what can be a meaningful proposition in the first place?
So it's a fundamental problem about the very architecture of meaning.
Yeah, pretty much.
And what about, more specifically, semantic problems with this view? Like, the entry talks about the problem of empty names.
Right. So if the meaning of a name is just the object it refers to, then what happens when you have a name that doesn't refer to anything, like Vulcan? There was this hypothetical planet astronomers thought existed to explain some weirdness in Mercury's orbit, but it turned out not to be real. So if there's no Vulcan, then Vulcan doesn't seem to have a referent. And if meaning is just reference, then the name should be meaningless. But we can clearly use it in sentences and think about it, and it seems to have some kind of meaning. So Russellian semantics needs a way to deal with that.
Right? It's like we can still talk about things that don't exist, which is a pretty important feature of language, especially for us philosophers.
No kidding.
And then there's the classic puzzle from Frege about names that refer to the same person, like Clark Kent and Superman.
Oh, yeah, that one's a real head scratcher. If Clark Kent and Superman pick out the same guy, then according to a basic Russellian view, they have the same meaning. So Clark Kent is Clark Kent and Clark Kent is Superman should express the same proposition, but that just feels wrong, doesn't it?
It does. The first one is just a boring tautology, but the second one is actually telling you something new and interesting, and you could believe one without believing the other, which shouldn't be possible if they meant the same thing.
Right, and Russellianism has to come up with some way to explain that difference.
So they've got ways to try to address these issues, but it gets pretty complicated. This brings us to Fregean semantics. How does Frege's approach try to solve these puzzles in a different way?
Frege brings in this really important concept of sense, which is the content of an expression. It's distinct from the reference. He uses this analogy of looking at the moon through a telescope. The moon itself is the reference. The image you see through the telescope is the sense it's representing the moon in a specific way. And then there's your subjective experience of seeing that image, which is more like a thought or an idea.
Okay, so in the Clark Kent and Superman case, they have the same reference, but different senses, different ways of presenting that person.
That's the idea.
And how does that solve the problem?
Well, because they have different senses, the sentences Clark Kent is Clark Kent and Clark Kent is Superman actually express different propositions. The first one is trivially true because the senses are the same, but the second one is informative because it's saying that these two different ways of presenting the same person actually pick out the same individual.
Clever. So even though they refer to the same guy, the way we're thinking about him is different, and that makes a difference in meaning.
Yeah, it's all about the mode of presentation.
Right. But Frege semantics has its own set of challenges, right? What are some of those?
One big one is explaining exactly what sense is. The telescope analogy is nice, but it's still just an analogy. We need a more precise account of what these modes of presentation are and how they work.
Yeah, what are they really?
Right. And then there's a particular version of Fregeanism called Freean descriptivism, which says that the sense of a name is basically like a definite description that uniquely picks out the refer. But Kripke came up with some really powerful arguments against that.
Oh yeah, Kripke. What were his main points?
Well, he argued that we can imagine situations where, for example, Aristotle exists, but he's not the greatest philosopher of antiquity. Or maybe someone else is the greatest philosopher, but it's not Aristotle. So our understanding of Aristotle doesn't seem to be tied to that particular description.
That's a good point. It's like the meaning of a name isn't just a list of facts about the person.
Exactly. And so non-descriptive Fregeanism tries to get away from tying sense to a specific description. But then the question is, if sense isn't a description, how does it manage to determine the reference? How does it pick out the right thing in the world?
Right. It can't just be magic.
Nope. The entry mentions something called epistemic two-dimensionalism, which is a newer take on Freudianism that tries to combine it with possible world semantics to give a better account of how sense works. But it gets pretty technical.
I bet it does. Are there any other problems for Freudianism that we should touch on?
Yeah, there's the issue of how fine-grained senses are. Kripke has this great example with ketchup and ketchup. If someone thinks those are two different things, does that mean they have different senses?
Well, in their mind, they do, right?
Yeah, but it seems like that could lead to way too many different senses, even for things that are basically synonymous. And then there are problems for explaining how we can accurately report what someone believes if their sense of a word has to be exactly the same as ours.
So even with its strengths, Freudianism has its own share of puzzles.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've covered the classical semantic theories. The entry then moves on to alternatives to classical semantic theories. Let's start with Davidsonian semantics. What's the big idea there?
Davidson, building on Tarski's work on truth, says that a semantic theory shouldn't focus on assigning things as meanings. Instead, it should be all about giving a theory of truth for a language.
Okay, so instead of saying this word means this object,
Mm.
we'd be saying this sentence is true under these conditions.
Right. And the way you do this is by coming up with something called T sentences. These are sentences that look like this. Snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. So for every sentence in the language, you give a T sentence that spells out the conditions that make it true.
So basically the meaning of a sentence boils down to when it's true.
Hmm.
But how does just knowing a bunch of T sentences actually translate into understanding a language?
Davidson's argument is that if you have a truth theory that correctly gives you a T sentence for every sentence in the language, then you understand that language. Because those T sentences, taken together, they tell you what each sentence means by telling you when it's true.
It's a very minimalist approach to meaning.
It is.
But the entry brings up some problems, like what about non-interpretive T sentences?
Right. So the thing is, not just any true T sentence will do. You could have a T sentence that's true, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about the meaning of the sentence you're trying to understand. Like, snow is white is true if and only if grass is green. That's a true T sentence, but it doesn't eliminate the meaning of snow is white at all. You need T sentences that are actually interpretive.
So how do you pick out the right T sentences? The ones that actually capture meaning?
That's a big issue. And then there's the information problem.
Right.
Even if you had all the right T sentences, would just knowing those really be enough to understand the language? Like, imagine you knew that Longer Azulie is true if and only if London is pretty. Would you really understand the French sentence just from that?
Probably not.
Yeah.
So knowing when something is true doesn't automatically give you understanding.
It seems that way.
Okay, what about internalist semantics? This one seems to focus on how our minds make meaning.
Yeah, this is a big shift. Internalist semantics rejects the idea that meaning is primarily about how our words connect to things in the world. They say that meaning is about what's happening inside our heads, in our mental representations. So words don't inherently have reference or truth conditions in the way that the classical theories say.
So meaning isn't about how language hooks onto the world. It's about something going on in the speaker's mind. What do internalists think meaning actually is then?
One idea from Piotrowski is that meanings are like instructions for building concepts, which are these mental representations. So the meaning of cat isn't the set of all cats out there. It's a set of instructions in your mind that tell you how to build a concept of a cat.
So it's more about how our minds work than about the external world. What are some reasons why someone would be drawn to this view?
One big one is that it seems to handle polysemy better. Like the word line, it can mean so many different things. A fishing line, a line of people, a line on a piece of paper. Internalists say that their approach, where meanings are these instructions for building concepts, can better explain how all those different uses are connected.
Okay, so internalism puts the emphasis on the mental reality of language. What about inferentialist semantics?
Inferentialism turns things upside down. Instead of starting with truth and reference, they start with the idea of good and bad inferences, good and bad reasoning. And they say that truth and reference are actually defined in terms of what's preserved by good inferences.
So the meaning of a word isn't about what it points to, it's about how it fits into our reasoning processes.
Exactly. Brandom, who's a big proponent of this view, argues that the focus should be on the semantic properties of sentences because inferences are between sentences. And inferentialists tend to be holists about meaning, which means they think you can't really understand the meaning of one word or sentence in isolation. You have to grasp its whole network of connections to other words and sentences in the language.
It's about the whole system of language, not just the individual pieces.
That's right.
All right, then we've got dynamic semantics. This one seems to bring the actual use of language into the picture.
Yes, dynamic semantics is all about how meaning unfolds in real-time conversations. They say that the meaning of a sentence isn't just the proposition it expresses, but also its potential to change the context of the conversation.
So it's not just what you're saying, it's how what you're saying changes the whole conversational landscape.
Right, like when you say, a man walked in, he sat down. The pronoun he in the second sentence. It's referring back to a man in the first, even though a man wasn't a referring expression in the usual sense. Dynamic semantics can explain that by saying that the first sentence introduced a temporary referent into the conversation, and the pronoun picks up on that.
That's a really neat way to think about it. It's like language is this constantly evolving thing, and each sentence builds on what came before it.
Exactly, it's very process-oriented.
Last but not least, we have expressivist semantics. This one started out in ethics, right?
It did. Expressivism tries to explain the meaning of certain kinds of sentences, especially ethical sentences, not in terms of truth conditions, but in terms of what the speaker is expressing.
So like when I say stealing is wrong, I'm not stating a fact about the world. I'm expressing my disapproval of stealing, my commitment to a moral rule.
Right. There are different versions of expressivism, but they all focus on the speaker's mental state or attitude. And while it started in ethics, it's been applied to other areas of language too.
Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour of semantic theories. So many different ways to try to answer the question, what is meaning? Now, the entry shifts gears and talk about metasemantic theories. Now we're asking, why does meaning even exist, and why is it the way it is?
Yeah, now we're going deeper, looking for the foundations of meaning. The entry uses this example from Kaplan about Pig Latin. So the fact that osne means snow in Pig Latin, that's a semantic fact.
Right.
But the reason why it has that meaning, how Pig Latin came about, the conventions people use when they speak it, those are all metasemantic questions.
So it's like semantic theories describe the map, and metasemantic theories explain how the map was made.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, the entry mentions two different ways that people use the term metasemantics. One has to do with explaining those context-sensitive expressions, but there's a second sense, which seems to be the main focus here. What's that all about?
The second sense of metasemantics is all about explaining why expressions have the semantic properties they do, whether it's the character of a context-sensitive term or the content of a more stable expression. It's about getting to the root of why language means anything at all.
Okay, so digging down to bedrock. And it's worth noting that some philosophers are skeptical of this whole metasemantic project. Why is that?
Yeah, some people think that maybe meaning just is fundamental. It can't be explained in terms of anything else. Or maybe they think that our current theories of meaning aren't good enough yet to give us a solid basis for doing metasemantics. Sort of like, we need to get our house in order before we start decorating.
Makes sense. But for those who do think metasemantics is a worthwhile endeavor, what are some of the main approaches?
Well, one big divide is between mentalist and non-mentalist theories. Let's start with the mentalist ones.
Okay, so what do the mentalists say?
Mentalist approaches say that meaning ultimately comes from the minds of language users. One influential view, from David Lewis, is that conventions are what ground meaning. So we have these conventions of truthfulness. Speakers generally try to say things that are true, and trust listeners generally believe what speakers say. And these conventions, together with the actual beliefs that people have, that's what gives rise to meaning.
So meaning is about these shared patterns of believing and speaking within a community.
Right.
The entry also talks about the Gratian program. How does that fit in?
The Gratian program goes a step further and tries to explain meaning in terms of the speaker's intentions. So when you say something, you have a certain intention. You want your listener to believe something, you want them to recognize that you have that intention, and you want their belief to be based on that recognition.
So it's all about these nested intentions.
Exactly, and it's a very influential view, but there are some famous counterexamples.
Ah, yes. Philosophers love their counterexamples. What are some issues with Grice's view?
Well, sometimes you might say something without intending to get your listener to believe something new, like if you're reminding them.